Hello musicians, welcome back to my studio. This is Kay Hooper and I'm talking to you about sensory integration for musicians. In this video I'm going to introduce you to the general geography of the brain. It's really not as difficult as you might think. When we're talking about the brain, we're talking about areas that are called lobes. Lobes are large generalized areas which are dedicated to certain kinds of input or problem solving or networking in the brain. A lot of us are familiar with the idea that we have a frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in the front, which makes it very easy to remember. The frontal lobe is the part of our brain that very often our academic training sets about to educate. If you make a fist with your hand and put it here on your forehead, you'll be approximately where your prefrontal cortex is. The prefrontal cortex, which is about that part of the brain, is where a lot of our decision making gets made. The rest of the frontal lobe would be approximately here if you put your hands over the top of your head in this way. That frontal lobe is dedicated to decision making, which is actually based on getting information from the rest of the brain. Right behind the frontal lobe, you've got three areas that are somewhat like headbands, and those areas are in general dedicated to sensory motor integration. Behind those areas, you have the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe is dedicated to space. We learn about where we are in space, where other objects are in space, where other musicians, performers, actors are in space by networking information through the parietal lobe. Behind the parietal lobe, which is going to be about here, is your occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is the place in the brain that actually gives you information about what you see, about your vision, and how you translate those signals. Below the occipital lobe, about here, will be the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is a place where a lot of our long-term muscle memory gets stored. If you play scales a lot, like most musicians, chances are you've stored how to play those scales in your cerebellum. That's why they tend to come out pretty reliably most of the time. Above and in front of the cerebellum is the temporal lobe, about here. And the temporal lobe processes information from your sense of hearing. There also are various areas in this lobe that are dedicated to memory. While there are many other areas in the brain that have very specific dedications, we're going to primarily be dealing with these parts of the brain that are giving us sensory information. There are many ways you can find out about the other areas. Please go do that. But notice how much of the brain is really dedicated to senses and emotions. Those areas need to be trained so that we can access them whenever we need to make our music more beautiful and our playing experience much more enjoyable.